The last crossing of the night leaves Harwick Landing at 11:45, and I have run it for going on 19 years. That's not a boast, it's just context. By the time any of this started, I knew the Marin Quay, the way you know a house you grew up in, not because you memorized it, but because your body remembers where the floor creaks and your hand finds the light switch without thinking. I knew how she sat in the water at different loads, how she pulled left in a crosswind above 15 knots, how the starboard engine ran a quarter degree hotter than the port, and had done so for at least a decade before I took over. I knew the lake, not in any romantic sense. I knew it the way you know a road you've driven in the dark, by feel, by timing, by the specific quality of the silence when something is off. Heron Lake is not a large lake. The crossing from Harwick to Teller Point is 4.5 miles. On a calm night in summer, you can see the lights of one town from the dock of the other. The ferry exists because the road around the lake is 23 miles and passes through a stretch of county highway that floods reliably every spring and ices badly every winter. For the people who live on the Teller Point side, mostly older, a few fishing operations, a scattering of seasonal rentals that stay occupied longer than they used to, the Marin Quay is just faster. And for the ones who don't drive anymore, it's the only practical way in. We run 4 crossings each direction from March through November. The last boat from Harwick goes at 11:45. The last boat from Teller Point goes at 10:15, which means that on the return leg, I am almost always alone, or close to it. A few stragglers sometimes, people who missed the earlier boat and don't want to drive around. Mostly I come back empty. I live in a company-owned apartment above the Harwick Harbor Master's office, which sounds worse than it is. The rent comes out of my paycheck at a rate the county set in 1987 and hasn't revisited since. I have a kitchen, 2 rooms, and a view of the dock. When I'm off-season, I help with maintenance on the hull and the engines, do some consulting work for a charter company 2 counties north, and mostly read. I have a daughter in Madison who calls on Sundays and means it. I was married until I wasn't, which was about 12 years ago, and the reason wasn't complicated. The job is what it is, and eventually the job was more mine than the marriage was ours. That's the most honest way I know to put it. The point is that by October of last year, my life had a specific shape that I understood, and I was not dissatisfied with it. There's a difference between loneliness and solitude, and I had arrived, somewhere in my mid-50s, at something closer to the second. The passenger first appeared on a Wednesday. I remember it was Wednesday because the Teller Point Fire District meets on Tuesday evenings, and several of the regular faces had been on the 10:15 return, still wearing their reflective jackets, arguing about a road grade. By the Wednesday 11:45, I was in my normal rhythm. Deck lights on, gangway checked, the ticket counter closed and folded by my deckhand Petra, who does the last run with me on weekdays. She handles boarding and the forward deck. I handle the wheelhouse. We had 11 passengers that night. I know because Petra's count matched my own, which I do by habit from the wheelhouse window while she tears tickets. 11 people. I noted the time, released the lines, and took us out. The crossing runs about 22 minutes in calm weather. That night was calm, genuinely calm. The kind of flat water you get in October when the wind drops, and the temperature hasn't decided yet whether to fall. I remember the surface looked almost oiled. I don't love that. A little chop is normal. Completely still water on Heron Lake usually means weather building from the northwest, and you sometimes only get a few hours of warning before it turns. I watched the instruments, kept us on heading, and did not think about the passenger at the stern until Petra came up to the wheelhouse and said, 11 in, 10 off. She said it the way you'd report a minor discrepancy in the supply count. Not alarmed, mildly puzzled. I cut the engine to idle and turned around in my chair. Through the rear window of the wheelhouse, I could see the aft deck. There was one man seated at the far end of the bench that runs across the stern, port side. He was dressed in dark clothing. I couldn't make out much more than that in the deck light, which doesn't reach well to the corners. He was sitting forward, elbows on his knees, looking at the water. Did he miss the stop? I asked. Didn't move when I called everyone off, Petra said. Didn't look up. I went back myself. The dock workers at Teller Point had already pulled in the gangway, and the Marin K was drifting slightly on the mooring lines. The man was still seated. He was maybe 60, maybe older. It was hard to tell in that light. Weathered face, dark jacket, work boots with the laces done plain. He had no bag that I could see. "Sir," I said, "this is Teller Point. You've reached the end of the line." He didn't answer. He wasn't asleep. I could see him breathing, slow and even, and his eyes were open, looking at the water off the stern. I stepped closer. "Sir, the boat's going back now. You'll need to disembark." Nothing. I looked back toward the dock. One of the Teller Point workers, a younger guy named Cass, who'd worked that pier for maybe 3 years, was watching from the gangway platform. I made a gesture. He shrugged, which meant he hadn't seen the man board. That was already wrong. You don't not see someone board. The dock is lit, the gangway is narrow, and Cass's job at departure is specifically to watch the boarding count. But the man was clearly there, clearly breathing, and I was not going to physically remove a 60-year-old man from my boat at 11:40 at night, if I could avoid it. So I went back to the wheelhouse and I took us home. On the return crossing, I checked twice through the rear window. He didn't move, sat in the same position, forearms on his knees, looking at the water. Petra went back at the halfway point, and he didn't respond to her either. Didn't turn his head, didn't acknowledge her in any way. Not hostile, just absent. When we came back into Harwick, the gangway went down. He stood up, walked to the bow, and stepped off the boat like he'd been waiting patiently for something entirely different than what had just happened. He walked up the dock without looking back, turned north on the harbor road, and disappeared. Petra and I stood on the deck for a moment. She said, "Okay, just that." I filed the standard end-of-night log, noted a passenger count discrepancy 11 boarded at Harwick. 10 disembarked at Teller Point. 1 returned and wrote it off as a man who'd fallen asleep or spaced out and missed his stop. The next Wednesday, he was there again. I didn't recognize him immediately because I wasn't looking for him. Petra had 11 on her count. I went through the standard departure procedure. It was only midway across when I glanced back through the rear window that I noticed the single figure at the stern bench. Same seat, same posture. I told myself it was coincidence. But when we arrived at Teller Point and 9 people walked off, and Petra came to the wheelhouse door and said 11 in, 9 off, I felt something in my chest that I didn't have a precise name for. Not fear, exactly, but a kind of focused attention, the way the lake commands it before weather comes. 2 this time, I said. 2, she confirmed. I went back. There was the man I'd seen before. Same position, same dark jacket. And beside him, 2 seats down the same bench, a woman. Older. She wore a gray coat and had her hands folded in her lap, and was looking at the water the same way he was. They weren't together as far as I could tell. No conversation, no acknowledgement of each other. I spoke to them both. Neither responded. I went back to the wheelhouse and I sat there for a full minute just thinking. Then I did the thing I always do when something doesn't add up. I checked the draft. The Marin K has a draft gauge visible from the wheelhouse. It's not fancy, just a calibrated scale on the hull that I can read from a mounted camera, and we check it at departure and arrival against the posted passenger load tables. It's a habit from training, and I've never stopped doing it. At 9 passengers remaining aboard me, Petra, and 7 others we'd already offloaded. I should have been sitting close to empty load draft, maybe an inch or two heavy accounting for fuel. I was reading 4 inches heavy. I went back and found the manifest from the earlier crossing, ran the numbers. The empty weight plus Petra plus me plus 9 passengers gave me a specific expected draft. The additional 4 inches represented roughly 300 to 400 pounds above that. There were 2 people sitting at my stern who registered on the water, but who, as far as Cass on the Teller Point dock and Petra on the gangway could account for, had never boarded. I took us back to Harwick. When the gangway went down, the man stood first, walked off without looking at me, turned north on the harbor road. The woman followed, about 30 feet behind him. She turned south. I went into the harbor master's office and pulled the boarding log Petra keeps, the paper one she signs at end of shift. 11 passengers, with her count marks and the time. I pulled my fuel log. I ran the draft numbers again. Everything confirmed what I'd already measured. The boat had been carrying the weight of 2 additional people. I set the logs down on the desk and looked out the window at the dock, at the water, at the lights of Teller Point just visible 4.5 miles away. I'd been running this crossing for 19 years. I knew what the numbers were supposed to say. I also knew that the only rational explanation, some error in measurement, some variable I wasn't accounting for, required me to believe that 2 separate and independently maintained measurement systems were both wrong in the same direction at the same time. I didn't believe that, but I also wasn't ready for what I was starting to consider instead. I sat down in the chair behind the desk, and I thought about my draft gauge, which I'd last calibrated in March. I thought about Petra's count, which had never once in 4 years been wrong by more than 1, and that one time had been a toddler who'd been counted with the parents' ticket. I thought about Cass, who'd shrugged from the gangway, who hadn't seen them board. I thought about the man walking north on the harbor road and the woman walking south, neither of them turning around. I pulled out the lake chart, the laminated one I keep folded in the chart drawer, a copy of the county survey from 1994, with the navigation markings I've added over the years. I spread it on the desk and looked at it. Harwick, Teller Point, the crossing lane marked in pencil, the soundings. In the lower left corner of the chart, printed in the original county survey notation, was a small marking I had looked at dozens of times and never thought about. It was labeled with a dash and the words, Carver's Point, decommissioned. I had assumed it meant a former fuel stop. There were 3 or 4 similar notations on the chart, old commercial docks that had closed over the decades. I put my finger on it. It sat roughly 2/3 of the way along the crossing lane, slightly south of our direct heading. The chart was from 1994. In 19 years of running this route, I had never stopped there, never been asked to stop there, and never seen anything at that location except open water. I folded the chart back up. I was not ready to say what I was thinking, but I also noted that both nights had been completely calms, the same flat, oiled surface, the same absence of wind. And I noted that on both nights, the 2 passengers had sat at the stern, looking back at the water we'd already crossed, not toward Teller Point, not toward Harwick, back toward the middle of the lake. I spent Thursday doing something I hadn't done in years, which was go looking through the county historical records. The harbor master's office has a filing cabinet in the back room that nobody touches because everything important is digital now. But behind that cabinet, pushed against the wall, are 4 cardboard boxes that came over from the old county dock office when it closed in 2009. I'd been told once they were operational logs, maintenance records, correspondence. I'd never opened them because I'd never had a reason to. I found the box labeled Heron Lake District Schedules / Routes 1948 to 1991 in about 10 minutes. Inside were accordion folders, each one labeled by decade. I pulled the one marked 1960s and sat down on the floor with it because there was nowhere else to sit in that back room. Most of what was in there was what you'd expect. Maintenance schedules, fuel invoices, a long thread of correspondence about a dock repair that took 3 years and 2 contractors to complete. But in the 1962 folder, I found a laminated card, the kind that would have been posted for passenger information, and it listed the daily crossings. 4 from Harwick, 4 from Teller Point, just like now. And at the bottom, in smaller print, a 5th entry that read, Carver's Landing, by request, seasonal, subject to conditions. Not Carver's Point. Carver's Landing. The distinction mattered. A point is geography. A landing is infrastructure. It meant at some point there had been a dock. I looked for more and found a maintenance invoice from 1971 referencing repairs to secondary mooring, Carver's Landing approach, and then nothing after that. Whatever Carver's Landing had been, it had stopped appearing in the paperwork before the 1980s folder began. I put everything back the way I'd found it, went upstairs, and ate lunch standing at my kitchen window looking at the dock. By request, seasonal, subject to conditions. I turned that over for a while. The obvious reading was that it had been a private stop, someone's property on the lakeshore, accessible by water, used occasionally. That happened on other lakes in the region. A landowner would arrange with the ferry operator for an informal stop, pay a per-use rate, and that would be that. When the property changed hands or the arrangement ended, the stop went away. But the chart from 1994 still labeled it. That was 2 decades after the last maintenance record. County surveys don't usually keep labeling a location that no longer exists. They update, or they drop the notation entirely. The fact that it was still there in 1994, even marked as decommissioned, meant someone in the county office had considered it worth noting. I called the county assessor's land records line on Thursday afternoon, which is not something I'd ever had reason to do before. The woman who answered was patient and clearly accustomed to people who didn't know exactly what they were asking for. I gave her the approximate coordinates from the chart and asked if there was a parcel on record. She put me on hold for 4 minutes. When she came back, she said there was a parcel, that it was listed as county-held open water buffer, and that the last private ownership transfer on record was 1974. She couldn't tell me the name without a formal request. I thanked her and hung up. County-held, which meant nobody had been maintaining a dock there since at least 1974, and probably longer. Whatever the landing had been, it was 50 years gone. I told myself that should have settled something. Instead, it made the draft numbers feel more important, not less. Because if nothing was out there, then the weight I was carrying on those 2 nights had no explanation at all. Friday was a scheduled maintenance day, and I spent it on the engine room, which needed it. Petra came in for half a day to help me run a systems check on the navigation instruments, including the draft gauge. She didn't ask why I wanted it done early. Petra has been working with me for 4 years, and she understands that when I want something checked, I want it checked. The gauge was accurate to within an acceptable tolerance. We calibrated it anyway. While she was packing up her tools, she said, without looking at me, "The Wednesday passengers." "Yeah," I said. "I've been thinking about the count." "Me too." She zipped her bag. "I've been doing counts for 4 years. I don't miscount." "I know." So either they boarded somewhere I wasn't watching, or She didn't finish that. Or they didn't board at all, I said. She looked up at me then. She's practical in a way I respect. She doesn't dramatize things, and she doesn't dismiss them either. She just sat with it for a moment. And then she said, "The draft is the part I can't get around." Same. What are you going to do? I hadn't fully decided. Watch, I said. Wednesday. She nodded, picked up her bag, and left. That was the most either of us said about it, which is probably why we work well together. Saturday, I drove around the lake. It took 40 minutes on the county highway to reach the approximate area where Carver's Landing would have been. The geometry of the chart put it on the eastern shoreline, a stretch that was mostly undeveloped, state-protected buffer land, with a gravel access road that the county used for water quality monitoring. I parked at the road's end and walked to the water. There was nothing there. A narrow gravel beach, some scrub willow, the remnants of what might once have been a graded approach to the water's edge. No dock, no pilings, no hardware of any kind. Whatever had been built here had been removed cleanly enough that nature had mostly finished the job. I stood there for a few minutes. The lake was flat that afternoon too. One of those late October days that feel borrowed from a different season. I could see both towns from where I was standing. Harwick slightly left, Teller Point directly across. From here, the crossing lane ran almost directly overhead. I looked at the water. It looked back, the way water does. On the drive home, I stopped at the Harwick Library, which is a single-room operation, run by a woman named Dolores, who has been there since before I moved to town, and who knows where everything is, with the confidence of someone who cataloged it herself. I asked if she had anything on local history, specifically lake commerce before 1980. She gave me a slim-bound volume self-published by the Heron Lake Historical Society in 1998. 90 pages, spiral-bound, black and white photographs. I sat at one of the two reading tables and went through it. Carver's Landing appeared on page 41. One paragraph and one photograph. The photograph showed a wooden dock extending into the lake. In the background, partially visible through trees, was a building, a house or a lodge, something with a pitched roof and a covered porch. On the dock there were two figures, both turned away from the camera, looking at the water. The caption read, "Carver's Landing, circa 1955. Private dock, East Shore. Seasonal ferry stop, discontinued 1973. The paragraph said that Carver's Landing had served a private residence belonging to the Carver family from approximately 1940 until the property was sold to the county in 1974. It had functioned as an informal ferry stop during the summer season. The residence had been demolished after the county acquisition. That was all. I looked at the photograph for a long time. There was nothing unusual about it. Two people on a dock, looking at the water, a building behind them, an ordinary summer afternoon in 1955. But the image stayed with me on the drive home. Something at the edge of it I couldn't quite place. It wasn't until I was unlocking my apartment door that I understood what it was. The water in the photograph was flat, completely still. The same oiled surface I'd seen on both Wednesday crossings. I'm not suggesting photographs prove anything. A calm day is a calm day. But I filed it, the way I file everything that might be relevant. Wednesday came. I made one change to the routine. I asked Petra to do the count twice at boarding, once at the ticket gate, once at the gangway, and I asked Cass at the Teller Point dock to do the same at disembarkation. I told them both it was a compliance check, which wasn't entirely false. The county authority that oversees the ferry does periodic audits of our passenger counting procedures, and asking for a double count wasn't out of the ordinary. Petra's gate count, 12. Petra's gangway count, 12. Cass's disembarkation count, 10. We carried 12 people across. 10 got off at Teller Point. 2 remained. The man, same seat. And 2 seats from him in the other direction this time. A second man, younger than the first, maybe 40, wearing a canvas jacket. Same posture as the others. Elbows on knees, eyes on the water behind us. I checked the draft at Teller Point. 6 inches heavy. 6 inches. When I ran it against the empty load tables, that represented approximately 550 to 600 pounds above the correct displacement for the verified remaining passenger count. 2 people, present on my instruments, present to my eyes, not present on my counts. I stood in the wheelhouse doorway and looked at the 3 of them, the older man, the newer man, the space between them, and I thought about how I was going to write this in the log, because I was going to write it. That's not something I could have explained to anyone who didn't understand what 19 years of accurate logs meant to me. But the short version is this. The log is not a legal document. It's not a performance. It's not something I maintain because I'm required to. It's a record of what actually happened. The moment I start writing something other than what actually happened, the log becomes worthless. And the log being worthless means I'm operating blind. I wrote, passenger count discrepancy, 3rd consecutive Wednesday. Boarded 12, disembarked 10 at Teller Point, returned 2. Draft measurement at Teller Point showed vessel riding 6 inches heavy above calculated load, consistent with approximately 550 to 600 pounds, additional unaccounted displacement. Double count conducted by Harwick Boarding, P. Voss, and Teller Point Dock, C. Hargrove. Discrepancy confirmed by both independent counts. Visual observation of 2 additional passengers confirmed. Identity unknown. No tickets presented. Method of boarding unknown. I wrote a method of boarding unknown and read it back and let it sit. Petra appeared in the doorway while I was still holding the pen. She'd been on the aft deck. Same man, she said. +1. +1. She leaned against the door frame. After a moment, she said, the draft difference. Last week it was 4 inches. Now it's 6. Yes. That's not the same anomaly twice. That's the anomaly growing. She was right, and I knew it. But hearing her say it made it harder to keep in the category of something I was still calmly assessing. I set the pen down. What are they looking at? She asked. Back there, every time. What are they looking at? I'd been thinking about that since the first night. What I'd been avoiding saying, even privately, was that from the position they sat and the angle they held their heads, they appeared to be watching a fixed point in the water behind us. Not our wake, not the horizon, a fixed point, roughly 2/3 of the way across the lake, roughly where the chart said Carver's Landing had been. I don't know, I said, which was true as far as it went. She straightened up. I'm not going to pretend I'm completely fine with this. I know. But I'm also not going to stop showing up. She said it plainly, the way she says most things. I just need you to know that I know it's not a counting error. It's not a counting error, I agreed. She went back to the deck. I watched the water on the instruments until we reached Harwick. At disembarkation, the 2 newcomers walked off the same as before. The older man first, turning north. The new man walked off behind him, stopped at the end of the gangway, and looked back at the boat. Not at me. I was in the wheelhouse, but at the stern, at the bench where they'd been sitting. He stood there for about 5 seconds, long enough that I noticed it, and then he turned and walked south. Same direction as the woman the week before. I went back to the stern after they were gone and stood where they'd been sitting. The bench was dry. The deck was dry. There was nothing there. No object left behind. No marking. I ran my hand along the wood because I didn't know what else to do. and I needed to do something with my hands. On the inside edge of the bench rail, right at the point where the stern passenger would rest their forearm, I found a groove worn into the wood. A long, shallow groove, the kind made by repetitive contact over a long period of time. It was smooth, almost polished. I straightened up and looked at the water. The groove was on the port side of the stern bench, the same side where the first man always sat. It was worn into the wood the way a hand wears into a tool handle, not recent, not this season, not this decade. Something that accumulated, slowly. I went upstairs and opened my copy of the Historical Society volume to page 41. I looked at the photograph again. The two figures on the dock, turned away. The still water, the building behind them. I turned the book sideways to get a better look at the dock in the photograph. The dock railing, visible along one edge of the frame, had a wear groove in it too, in the same position, the same depth, as far as a 70-year-old photograph could tell me. I closed the book. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time. What I was looking at, if I was reading it honestly, was evidence of a pattern that predated me by decades, that predated the current Marin K entirely, since the vessel I run was built in 1989. Whatever wore that groove into my stern bench had been doing it before this boat existed, which meant it had worn the same groove into whatever boat came before, and into the dock at Carver's Landing, and it had been doing it long enough that the groove on my bench rail was deep and smooth and permanent. What I kept returning to, and couldn't stop returning to, was the weight. 4 inches 1 week, 6 inches the next. If that progression held, the following Wednesday would put me somewhere between 8 and 10 inches heavy. The Marin K is rated for a maximum loaded draft at a posted passenger capacity of 62. I was not anywhere near that limit, not yet. But the direction the numbers were moving was not nothing. The lake didn't stay flat on Wednesdays by coincidence. Whatever was using my boat was waiting for the conditions that made the water still enough to see something beneath it. And every Wednesday, the water was still enough, and the weight grew, and the passengers looked back toward the middle of the lake. I turned on my laptop and pulled up the county parcel records portal. I typed in the coordinates for Carver's Landing and entered my own name in the formal records request field. 3 days later, when the records came back, the previous owner of the parcel before the 1974 county acquisition was listed as estate of Thomas Carver, deceased 1973. Thomas Carver had died the same year the ferry stop was discontinued. I sat with that for a long time, too. The county records came with a name, and the name gave me somewhere to go. Thomas Carver had died in 1973, but estates leave paperwork, and paperwork has a way of persisting. I called the county recorder's office the following Monday and asked whether the 1974 transfer to county ownership had included any associated documentation. A probate filing, a deed of sale, anything with a contact name attached. The clerk I reached was helpful in the specific way that people are helpful when the request is simple and the files are old enough to be interesting. She found a probate reference number, gave me the name of the law firm that had handled the estate, and told me the firm had since merged twice and was now operating under a different name out of the county seat. The current firm's records department took 2 days to call me back. When they did, a paralegal named Grace told me that the original probate records were archived off-site, but that she could tell me the estate had had a single heir, a daughter named Ruth Carver, who at the time of probate had been 31 years old and a resident of Teller Point. Teller Point. She'd lived on the other side. I asked if there was a current address. Grace said she couldn't provide that. I thanked her and looked up Ruth Carver in the county property records. The search came back clean. No current property holdings in the county under that name. I tried the voter registration index through the county clerk's public portal. One result, a Ruth Carver, registered address on Mill Street in Teller Point. No recent activity flag, which in my experience usually means an elderly voter who doesn't reliably turn out rather than a lapsed registration. Mill Street in Teller Point is 4 blocks from the dock. I knew the street. I want to be clear about why I went. It wasn't that I thought an 82-year-old woman was going to explain what was happening on my boat. It was that she was the only living thread I could find attached to Carver's Landing, and I had run out of things to check that didn't involve going out to that location on the water and sitting there, which I wasn't prepared to do yet. Maybe I was building toward it. Going to see Ruth Carver was the last step I could take on land. I took the 10:15 boat over on Tuesday. It was not a Wednesday, so the water was unremarkable, a light chop from the northwest, normal for the season. I stood on the forward deck and watched Teller Point come toward me, and thought about how many thousands of times I had made this approach, and how different it looked from the passenger side. Mill Street was a residential block of older houses, most of them well maintained in the way that houses are maintained by people who have lived in them for a long time. Number 14 had a covered porch and a metal mailbox with the name Carver still on it in stick-on letters, some of them beginning to peel. A woman came to the door before I knocked. She must have seen me from the window. She was small, white-haired, wearing a cardigan over a house dress, and she looked at me with the direct, unsurprised expression of someone who had been waiting without knowing it. "You're the ferry operator," she said. "Yes, ma'am. Gil Vance." She held the door open and I came in. The living room was full of the accumulated evidence of a long life in one place. Framed photographs, books doubled up on shelves, a side table with a collection of small objects that had clearly been arranged by someone who cared about the arrangement. She sat in the chair nearest the window, the one with the worn armrests. I sat across from her on a sofa with a knitted throw folded over the back. She said, "How many now?" I looked at her. "3, I said, "adding 1 each week." She nodded, as if I'd confirmed something she'd already calculated. "It was always 3, she said, before my father stopped it." I didn't say anything. I let her take her time. "My father ran the stop himself," she said, "before the county ferry service. He had a small motor launch. He took people across the lake. Some of them needed to go to Harwick, some to Teller Point. But there were some." She stopped, looked at her hands. "Some who just needed to go as far as the middle. To the landing." She shook her head. "The landing was just the dock. It was what was near the dock that mattered." I waited. "My father believed the lake had a place in it," she said. "Not a physical place. A place where the surface could open, if the conditions were right. Still water, late in the year. He'd seen it once when he was young, before he built the dock. He said it looked like a door left open." She looked up at me. "I know how that sounds." "I'm listening," I said. He thought the people he carried, the ones who needed the middle, were people who were not quite finished, who had something unresolved enough that the lake held them the way a hook holds a fish. She said it without drama, which made it worse somehow. The ferry was a passage. Without the stop, they couldn't complete it. They would just ride, back and forth, adding weight. I thought about the groove on the bench rail, the groove that predated my boat by decades. "How many were there?" I asked carefully, "when your father was operating?" 3, she said. "Always 3 eventually. It built to 3 over several weeks, same as what you're describing, and then it stopped adding. 3 seemed to be the number the lake could hold in that condition." She paused. "He made the stop every Wednesday that the water was calm. He would slow the launch at that point in the crossing, and they would simply leave, walk down the dock, and not come back. And then he stopped. In 1973. She folded her hands in her lap. He was 74. He had a heart attack in August of that year. He recovered, but he couldn't operate the launch anymore. And the county ferry your predecessor route didn't make that stop because no one had told them to, and my father was too proud to explain why. She looked at the window, or too afraid that explaining it would change what it was. I sat with that for a moment. What happened when he stopped making the crossing? Nothing dramatic, she said. That's what I always expected. Something dramatic. Instead, the lake just stayed still more often. Every Wednesday, whether or not the weather called for it. And my father would sit on the porch and look at the water. She pointed toward the front window. On a clear day, from that elevation, you could see the lake. He died in December of 1973. Not from the heart trouble. He just stopped eating. I thought about the photograph in the Historical Society volume, the two figures on the dock, facing the water. I thought about how I'd assumed they were looking out at the lake. But photographs have no arrows. They could have been facing away from the camera for any number of reasons. Mrs. Carver, I said, the photograph in the county historical book, the one from 1955. 2 people on the dock. She looked at me steadily, my father and my mother. She died in 1960. I let that land and settle. Your mother died before the stop was discontinued. Yes. I didn't ask the next question out loud, but she answered it anyway. She was one of the 3, Ruth Carver said. For a year, she was one of the 3. And then one Wednesday evening, my father made the crossing, and she wasn't there anymore. And he said she had looked peaceful, which is the word he used, and he never talked about it again, except once, near the end. The room was quiet for long enough that I became aware of the clock on the mantelpiece. What did he say? Near the end? I asked. He said he was afraid the ones who were waiting now had been waiting since 1973. That was 50 years of Wednesdays, with still water and no passage. He said he didn't know if they were the same 3 that were always meant to come through, or if they were accumulating. She looked at me directly. He said that was the difference between 3 and more than 3, between a passage and something that becomes stuck. I drove back to the Teller Point dock and took the afternoon boat home. The water was still choppy, normal, nothing like a Wednesday. I stood on the deck and looked at the water and tried to think clearly. What I was now confronting was this: the assumption I had been quietly building that the passengers were a contained phenomenon, measurable and consistent, something I could observe from a safe distance and document, was wrong. The weight was increasing by 2 inches per week. That was not stasis. That was accumulation. And Ruth Carver had just told me that accumulation past a certain point was the thing her father had feared most. At 6 inches, 2 additional passengers. 50 years of Wednesdays without a stop. 50 years of whatever built up in still water with no place to go. I did not know what 3 passengers weighed versus what 50 years of accumulation could eventually put on my hull. And I didn't want to find out by reading the draft gauge on a night when the number was too high. The boat's rated capacity was not infinite. That was the practical thought. Underneath it was the other thought, the one I had been holding at arm's length since Ruth Carver said her mother's name without saying it. My wife's name had been Marin. I had named the boat after her when I took over the route, the year after we separated. It had seemed like the right kind of gesture at the time, the kind that is equal parts tribute and apology. She had known about it and had called to thank me, which had been a strange conversation, and we had not spoken since in any meaningful way. She was alive, remarried, living 2 states north. That was all fine. But I had named the boat Marin K, and the K was for Kessler, her maiden name, which she had gone back to using. And I had carried that name on the water for 12 years, and not once thought about it as anything other than what it was. A private gesture from a man who spends too much time alone. I went up to the wheelhouse and looked at the log. I thought about what Ruth Carver had said. People who were not quite finished, who had something unresolved enough that the lake helped them. I thought about the groove on the bench rail, the weight that kept growing. And then I thought about something I had not thought about in a long time, which was why Marin and I had actually separated. Not the surface version, the job, the hours, the absence. The real version, which was that in 2003, I had made a decision without telling her. A decision about whether to take a transfer to a better-paying route on a larger vessel 2 counties south, which would have meant moving, which would have meant her leaving a job she'd spent 8 years building, which would have meant disrupting the life we'd built in the one specific place she had told me she needed to stay. I had declined the transfer without telling her it had been offered. I had decided for her, to protect her from a choice that I had already made on her behalf, and I had carried that for 9 years before she found out. And she had left 6 months after she found out, and I had never once, in all the years since, admitted that the decision hadn't been about the job. It had been about my own need to stay on this water. 19 years on this lake, a boat with her name on it. I sat in the wheelhouse chair and understood, with the particular clarity that comes from something finally arranging itself into a shape you've been refusing to see, that I had been treating this ferry as a private monument to a relationship I'd ended with a lie of omission, and that whatever the passengers at my stern were, whatever the lake held that needed passage, they were on a vessel named for exactly the kind of unfinished thing that Ruth Carver's father had spent 30 years ferrying to its rest. I don't know what that meant precisely. I'm still not sure it meant anything causal, but it stopped being possible, after that, to think of myself as a neutral observer. The boat had a name on it. The name was mine. Whatever was accumulating in the weight of those crossings, I was not separate from it. I called my daughter that evening, which was a Tuesday, not our usual Sunday. She heard something in my voice and asked if I was okay. I told her I was fine, which was close enough, and we talked for 20 minutes about ordinary things. And when we hung up, I sat in the dark apartment and thought about what I was going to do on Wednesday. I had not yet done the thing that was obviously necessary. I had investigated, measured, researched, and now understood partially what the pattern was. But understanding the pattern and responding to it were different problems. Ruth Carver's father had made the stop for decades. The stop required intention, slowing at a specific location, being present at the rail, letting something complete. I did not know if simply stopping there was enough. I did not know if I was the right person to do it, or whether the right person mattered. I did not know how to slow the Marin K at a point in open water with no navigational marker and no dock, in conditions that required the lake to be flat, and manage the vessel safely while also being on the aft deck. Which was when I realized the practical problem I had been ignoring. I couldn't do it alone, and the only other person on that boat on Wednesday nights was Petra, who had told me she was not going to stop showing up, but who had not agreed to this, had not been told what this actually was, and who deserved to make the choice I was now facing with the same information I had. That was the thing I couldn't undo once I did it. I could tell her everything and ask for her help, and then she would know. And what she did with that knowledge was no longer mine to manage. I looked at the clock. It was nearly 10 at night. Too late to call. Wednesday was tomorrow. I set my alarm for 6 and went to bed, and did not sleep for a long time. I was at Petra's door by 7 in the morning. She lived 10 minutes from the harbor in a rented house she shared with no one, which I knew because she occasionally mentioned the quiet in the way people mention something they've made peace with. She answered in work clothes, which meant she'd been up for a while, and she looked at me with the particular attention of someone who already knew the conversation was going to be different from the usual ones. I told her everything. Standing in her kitchen while she made coffee, I went through all of it. The historical record, the county parcel, the photograph, Ruth Carver, the groove in the bench rail, the weight progression. I told her what Ruth had said about her mother. I told her what Ruth had said about accumulation. I did not tell her about the boat's name. That part I kept because I couldn't see how it changed the practical problem, and because some things you're allowed to carry privately, even when you're asking someone else to take on a share of the rest. Petra listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I value about her. When I was done, she poured 2 cups and set one in front of me and stood at the counter with hers. "How heavy can we go before it's a safety issue?" she said. Not a question exactly, more like thinking out loud. The rated maximum loaded draft is 31 inches. I've been running at roughly 23 on normal crossings this time of year. 6 inches above that puts me at 29. That's workable. But if it keeps adding, 2 inches a week, 2 inches a week. She looked at her cup. So in 3 weeks, we're at the limit, give or take. That's the calculation. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What did she say her father did exactly?" "At the stop. Slowed the launch. Was present. Let them leave." "That's not a lot of procedure." "No." "Did she say whether it mattered who was operating the vessel?" I shook my head. She didn't know. He never told her the specifics, just that he made the stop. And they went. Petra set down her cup. "Okay, here's the practical problem. We can slow at that point in the crossing. I can find the coordinates from your chart. We can mark it on the GPS as a waypoint. Slowing's not the issue. The issue is that you can't be in the wheelhouse and on the aft deck at the same time." "I know. So, one of us drives and one of us is at the stern." I had not been willing to say that out loud until she said it, because saying it out loud meant we were actually planning to do this. "Yes." She picked up her cup again. "I'll take the stern." "Petra, you know this boat better than I do at speed and in the dark. If something goes wrong with the vessel while we're stopped in open water at night, you're the one who needs to be at the controls." She looked at me steadily. "I'll take the stern." I wanted to argue, and I didn't have the argument. She was right. "You don't have to be there when they leave," I said, "or whatever happens. You can be on the forward deck." She shook her head. "If I'm going to do this, I'm going to do it correctly. Someone should be there, facing them." She paused. "I think someone should be there facing them." I didn't know where that came from. Instinct. Maybe. Or something she'd worked out privately. But it felt right in the way that some things feel right before you can explain them. We had no real instructions. We were working from a description of what a man with a motor launch had done in 1955, filtered through his daughter's memory and 50 years of elapsed time. But the gesture of it being present, being intentional, not turning away, seemed like it was probably the part that mattered. We went to the harbor, and I pulled the 1994 chart, and we marked the coordinates as precisely as I could estimate from the notation and the soundings. I entered it as a waypoint on the navigation system labeled WP-YNT, which meant nothing to anyone who might look at the log later. Intermediate waypoint. Routine. I checked the draft gauge and the mooring and the engine status. Everything normal. The sky was overcast but dry, and the wind was low, about 6 knots from the northwest, which was light enough that the surface would likely be calm by late evening, when the temperature equalized. I noted the forecast, winds decreasing through the afternoon, calm expected by 8 p.m., holding through midnight, Wednesday conditions. We ran the normal schedule through the day. I was attentive in a way that probably showed, though none of the daytime passengers would have read it as anything other than a captain being careful. Petra and I didn't speak about it during the regular crossings. There was nothing more to plan, and going over it again would not have helped either of us. The 11:45 boarding was 12 passengers. Petra confirmed the count at the gate, confirmed it again at the gangway. 12. I noted the weather. Winds calm, surface flat, temperature 38 degrees Fahrenheit. The same oiled surface, the same specific quality of stillness that I now understood was not incidental. I took us out. About 6 minutes into the crossing, I checked the draft. 8 inches heavy. We had not yet reached the midpoint. The progression Ruth Carver had described 3 passengers. A stable number was not what I was seeing. We were at 8 inches and still in the first third of the crossing. I picked up the radio handset and keyed it to the internal channel. Petra. Copy. Draft is 8 inches at the 6-minute mark. It was 6 on arrival last week. This isn't the same progression. A pause. More than 3? I can't see the stern from here. Go check. Another pause. Longer. Gil. Her voice was level. There are 4 back here. 4. Last week had been 2. The week before had been 2. The pattern had not been adding 1 per week. It had been doing something else. Something that had produced a visible result of 1 added passenger per week while building toward a different threshold beneath the surface. And now, on the night we were attempting the stop, it had produced 4. I thought about what Ruth had said. He was afraid the ones who were waiting now had been waiting since 1973. That was 50 years of Wednesdays. 50 years was not 3. 50 years was something I had no number for. Come back to the wheelhouse, I said. She came. I showed her the draft reading. At 8 inches and climbing, it had moved to 8.5. In the 2 minutes since I'd checked, we were approaching the operational threshold faster than I had calculated. If the weight kept increasing at this rate through the crossing, we would be at or near the maximum safe draft before we reached the waypoint. If I make the stop and it doesn't work, I said, I need to be able to tell you to go to the forward deck, and I need you to go. She looked at the gauge. And if it does work, then we go home. What does it look like if it works? I didn't know. I think the draft normalizes. She was quiet for a moment. What does it look like if it doesn't work? I don't know that either. She nodded once, slowly. Okay. I watched the GPS. The waypoint marker sat ahead of us on the plotted course, a small triangle on the screen, and I watched the distance count down in tenths of a mile. 1.4, 1.2, 1.1. At 1 mile out, I throttled back to minimum forward speed. The engine note dropped and the bow wave fell away, and we sat on the water at barely 3 knots, drifting more than driving. The surface around us was perfect, flat in every direction, reflecting the overcast sky as a single sheet of pale gray, so that the horizon between water and cloud was hard to find. I checked the draft. 9.25 inches. At 9.25 inches I was carrying, in addition to the certified weight of the vessel, the fuel, Petra, myself, and 12 ticketed passengers, something in the range of 800 to 900 additional pounds. I thought about the groove in the bench rail. I thought about the photograph. I thought about Ruth Carver sitting in her chair with her hands folded, saying she was one of the 3 with the specific steadiness of someone who had carried a sentence for 60 years and finally found somewhere to put it. I thought about Marin, not the name on the hull. Marin herself, the particular quality of her patience, which had been considerable, and how I had taken it as permission when it was actually just love. How I had made a choice without telling her and carried it quietly for 9 years, which was not the same as resolving it. How I had put her name on this boat, which was not the same as an apology. How every crossing since had been, in some way I'd never examined, a circumference around an unfinished thing. The waypoint marker reached 0, and I held us there, engine idling, the vessel barely moving. "Go," I said. Petra went. I watched the draft gauge and the GPS position and the water, and I tried to breathe at a normal rate. The temperature readout on the instrument panel said 37 degrees. The wind indicator read 0. I was sitting in 0 wind on a flat lake at a point in open water that appeared on no current chart, no current schedule, and no document produced in the last 50 years, holding a vessel that was riding 9.5 inches above where it should have been. I looked at the rear camera feed. It covers the aft deck from a wide angle, mounted high on the stern superstructure, and it shows the bench and the water behind the vessel. In the feed, I could see Petra standing at the stern rail, facing aft, and I could see the bench. The figures were not clearly visible on the camera. That's the honest way to say it. The camera showed something shapes, weight differentials in the way the deck sat. I'm not sure exactly. But it did not show 4 distinct people the way you'd expect from a recording. It showed Petra, and it showed presences. The camera knew something was there, the same way the draft gauge knew, the same way Petra's count had known. Instrumentally, not photographically. Petra was standing with her hands at her sides, facing them, not moving. The draft gauge read 9.5 inches and held there. I watched the GPS. We were drifting slightly east, maybe 2 or 3 feet per minute, the current pushing us very gently off the waypoint. I made a small correction with the bow thruster, brought us back, held us. The gauge moved. Not up, down. 9.25. 9. 8.5. It was slow, slower than the build had been. The kind of change you have to watch for, because your eyes want to tell you it's not changing. It's just the light. It's just the vessel settling. But the needle was moving, and I watched it the way I watch weather coming across the lake, with the specific attention of someone who knows that what matters is the direction, not the current number. 8 inches. 7.75. On the rear camera, Petra had not moved. 7.5. 7. I thought about what Ruth's father had said near the end, the thing Ruth had repeated to me. He was afraid they were accumulating. And I thought about the difference between the word accumulating and the word waiting, and how those were not the same kind of patience. Accumulation implied pressure. Waiting implied intention. What I was watching on the gauge as the number slowly fell was something that looked, from the instrument side, like intention completing itself. 6.5. 6. The normal November loaded draft was 4 to 5 inches. I was still 2 inches above that, which meant not everything had resolved. I kept us at the waypoint, and then the gauge stopped falling. 5.75, and it held. I waited 3 full minutes. It did not move. I looked at the camera. Petra was still at the stern. She had not turned around. I keyed the radio. "Petra." A beat. "Copy. The gauge stopped at 5.75. It's not going to 4. Another beat. "I know." I looked at the GPS. We were exactly at the waypoint. The water around us was still, the engine barely turning. Every instrument reading was correct except the draft, which was still 2 inches heavy. "Is someone still back there?" I asked. She was quiet for longer than I liked. "There's one," she said. "The first man, the older one. He hasn't moved." I sat with that. 4 had come through and 1 had not. Not because the stop had failed. I could feel that it hadn't, the way you can feel an engine that's running right, but because one of them was not ready to go, or not able to go, or because whatever this was had a logic that I had been measuring in draft and not understanding in its own terms. The first man. The one who had appeared on the first night. The one who always took the portside seat. The one whose habit had worn the groove into the bench rail before this vessel had ever been built. The one who had been waiting since before 1973. I needed to make a decision, and I had been avoiding the shape of it, because the shape of it required me to be honest about something I had spent 12 years not being honest about. Ruth's father had made the stop for people who were not quite finished. Her mother had been one of the three. And one Wednesday, her father had made the crossing and she was gone. And he had said she looked peaceful. And Ruth had kept that word for 60 years and offered it to me in her living room as the only comfort available. But Ruth's father had known who he was carrying. He had known his wife. He had made the stop the same way every Wednesday, and eventually her particular unfinished thing had resolved. I was sitting at the waypoint with one passenger who hadn't gone through, and the draft was still 2 inches over, and Petra was at the stern, not moving, and I was in the wheelhouse. And I understood, with the kind of clarity that arrives when you have run out of the ability to look somewhere else, that I was not meant to do this from the wheelhouse. The practical argument I need to be at the controls, Petra should be on deck, had been a true argument for the operational problem I'd anticipated. It was not an argument anymore, because the operational problem had partially resolved itself, and what remained was not operational. What remained was the thing I had put the boat's name on instead of saying out loud. I engaged the autopilot, set it to hold position at the waypoint with the bow thruster assisting, and checked the drift rate. Less than a foot per minute. I had time. I set the radio to the emergency open channel so I could hear if anything changed, clipped my handheld to my belt, and walked back through the cabin to the aft deck. The aft deck was colder than the wheelhouse by several degrees. I felt it immediately, the specific cold of open water at night in late October, the kind that gets into your collar and stays there. The deck lights were on. The same lights that had shown me the man on the first night. The same light that never quite reached the corners. Petra turned when she heard the door. She looked at me, then at the wheelhouse, understanding the implication. "Autopilot," I said, "holding position. I'll hear anything that changes." She nodded and moved aside, not far, just enough to give me the rail. The man was still on the bench. Port side, same seat, elbows on his knees. He was looking at the water off the stern, and in the deck light I could finally see him clearly enough to hold the details. Older than 60, I revised. Closer to 70, maybe more. A working face, the kind that accumulates weather rather than age in any clean way. Dark jacket, worn at the elbows. Work boots, laced plain. His hands were large and rested loosely between his knees, and he had the posture of someone who had been sitting in exactly this position for so long that it had stopped feeling like waiting and started feeling like occupation. The water behind the vessel was flat. I could see the reflection of the overcast sky in it, and the faint luminescence of the hull lights rippling at the edges. And nothing else. No dock, no shore. Just open water and the dark above it, and the place we were holding. I stood at the rail, and I looked at him and I thought about what to say, which was the wrong approach. And after about 30 seconds, I understood that and stopped trying to compose anything. I said, "I'm sorry I took so long to stop." He didn't look at me, but something in his posture changed, a very slight shift, a settling, the way a load redistributes when you find the right balance point. I kept talking, not to him exactly, or not only to him, partly to the water, partly to the specific air above it, partly to the accumulated weight of the thing I was standing inside. "I know you've been here a long time," I said. "I don't know what you're waiting to finish. I don't know if it's mine to know." I put my hands on the rail. The metal was cold enough to feel through my gloves. But I think the stop is what was missing. Someone being here at this point and not turning away from it. I think that's what my job was, and I didn't know it until now. The draft gauge was not visible from here. I had the handheld clipped to my belt, and I could have checked it, but I didn't. Whatever was happening at a scale the instruments could measure, but not explain. And I had spent 19 years on this water, trusting my instruments over my own body's knowledge of the vessel. And tonight, I was going to trust the other thing. I said, "Whatever it is that's keeping you here, it doesn't have to keep keeping you." The man turned his head. He looked at me, directly, for the first time. And I want to be careful about how I describe this because I have no vocabulary for it that isn't borrowed from things I don't believe in. But what I can say is that his face was not frightening. It was tired in a way that went deeper than tiredness, the kind of tired that accumulates when something should have been released a long time ago, and wasn't. His eyes were dark, and they were present, and they were looking at me with an attention that felt like recognition, which is not the same as knowing someone. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he looked past me, toward the stern, at the water behind the boat, and I turned to follow his gaze, even though I'd told myself I wouldn't. The water at the stern was not flat anymore, or it was flat still, completely still. But there was something in the stillness that was different from the surrounding surface, a depth to it. Not literal depth, not a hole or a darkness, just a quality of the water at that specific point in our wake, where it looked less like a surface and more like what a surface is covering. Ruth's father had said it looked like a door left open, and I understood now why he'd used that word. Not because it was open in a threatening way, but because a door left open is simply a door that still has possibility in it, that hasn't been closed by whoever walked through last. I looked at it for a moment, and then I looked away, because I had the instinct, strong and clear, that it was not meant for me to look at for long. Some things are not dangerous the way weapons are dangerous. They are dangerous the way edges are dangerous only if you don't know what you're near. When I turned back, the bench was empty. Petra made a sound that was not quite a word. I understood it. I stood at the rail for a moment and felt the cold, and listened to the engine idling and watched the water settle back into itself, the surface going uniform, losing that quality it had carried for just a few seconds. I unclipped the handheld and checked the draft gauge remotely. 4.5 inches. Normal loaded draft for our actual verified passenger count. I stood there a moment longer. Then I went back to the wheelhouse. The rest of the crossing to Harwick, I did not think about anything consequential. I watched the instruments and made the small corrections the current required, and brought us into the dock at 12:14, 14 minutes later than scheduled, which I would note in the log as weather-related speed reduction, and which would raise no questions. The dock crew was on the night shift, a kid named Marco, who mostly kept his own company, and he caught the lines and secured them without looking up. Petra came to the wheelhouse as I was shutting down the secondary systems. She said, "Are you all right?" "Yes," I said. And then, because it was true, and she deserved the truth, I don't know if that's the right word, but I'm all right. She leaned against the doorframe the same way she had a week ago, when she'd said she wasn't going to stop showing up. "The draft is normal." "Yes, and you think it's finished?" I thought about that. I think whatever we were carrying is finished. Whether the stop itself is finished, Whether someone else will need to make it, I don't know. She nodded slowly. Do you think there's a way to know? Not in advance. She was quiet for a moment. I'll keep doing Wednesdays. I looked at her. She meant it straightforwardly, as a practical statement about her work schedule. And also, she meant the rest of it. I understood both. Thank you, I said. She left, and I finished the shutdown sequence and sat in the wheelhouse in the dark for a while. I logged the crossing. Departure time, arrival time, weather conditions. Passenger count 12 boarded, 12 disembarked, all counts confirmed. I logged the unscheduled speed reduction and the arrival delay. Everything accurate. Everything that could be verified by an external party matched the actual events of the crossing. I did not log the waypoint. I did not log the stop. I did not log the draft reading at the midpoint, or the figure on the bench, or what I'd said, or what had happened to the surface of the water for about 30 seconds, just before 11:45, that the instruments couldn't characterize, and my hands couldn't describe. Some things the log holds. Some things the log is not for. I walked up to my apartment and sat at my kitchen table with the lamp on, and the window showing the dock below, and the lake beyond it, flat and dark, and holding the reflection of the overcast sky, the way it holds everything without preference, without memory, the way water holds what is placed in it until the conditions change, and it releases. I thought about Marin. Not the name on the hull, not the gesture. Marin herself, the specific person I had chosen to protect from a choice by making it for her. The person whose patience I had categorized as permission rather than love, because that was easier to carry than the alternative. The person I had put at the center of my life on this water, and then arranged so that she wasn't actually here. I was not going to call her. That's not what I'm saying. She had a life, and I was not in it, and that was correct. Some things don't resolve by reopening. They resolve by being finally understood, and the understanding is the resolution even if it changes nothing visible. What I understood, sitting at that table, was that I had been running a private memorial on a public ferry for 12 years, and the memorial had been for something that wasn't dead, a relationship that had ended because of a thing I'd done, which is not the same as a thing that was taken from me, and the difference between those two is not nothing. Grief is appropriate for what's taken. For what you chose, even badly, something else is required. Something more like accounting. I had put her name on the boat because I couldn't say what I needed to say in any other form. And I had kept the name because removing it would have required acknowledging why I'd put it there in the first place. That was the unfinished thing I'd been carrying on this water. Not her. Mine. I sat with that for long enough that the lamp started to feel warm, and the kitchen started to feel like a room I actually occupied, rather than one I moved it through on the way to the next shift. At some point after midnight, I called my daughter. It was late, later than I should have called, and she answered on the second ring with the particular alertness of someone who had not been asleep, or who, if she had been, came awake quickly for the people she was used to worrying about. Dad. Not alarmed, just present. I know it's late, I said. It's okay. Are you all right? I thought about what Petra had asked me. I gave my daughter the same honest answer. I think so. I wanted to hear your voice. She was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that is not empty. Okay, she said. I'm here. We talked for a while. She told me about her week, the ordinary shape of it, the small problems and the small solutions. I listened and asked questions, and she answered them, and I noticed, somewhere in the middle of it, that I was not working to maintain the conversation from a distance. I was just in it. That was not entirely new, but it was more complete than usual, and she must have felt it too, because at some point she said, "You sound different tonight." "Good different or bad different?" I asked. "Just different," she said. "Like you're less far away." I didn't explain that. I just said, "Good. I'm trying to be less far away." She said goodnight, and I said goodnight, and I sat in the quiet kitchen afterward and thought about that. Less far away, as a direction, as something you can choose incrementally without needing to understand the whole shape of it before you start. In the morning, I went down to the dock early, before Petra arrived, before Marco finished his overnight log. I walked the length of the vessel, which is something I do periodically for maintenance, but which I was doing this time for a different reason. I walked the exterior. I ran my hand along the hull. I checked the mooring lines and the fenders, and the gangway hardware and the navigation lights. At the stern, I stopped. The name was painted on the transom in white letters, block print, the way it had been since the refit in 2014, when we'd done the hull. Marin K. 18 inches tall, clean and legible, and visible from the dock in any weather. I looked at it for a long time. I didn't change it. I want to be clear about that. I'm not telling this as a story about a man who removes a name from a boat as a gesture of release, because that would be a gesture, and what I was done with was gestures. The name could stay. It was a good name. It had always been a good name. What I was changing was not the name, but the relationship I had to seeing it every day. Whether I saw it as a monument to something unfinished, or as a boat's name, a working vessel, a thing that carried people across water and brought them home. It could be both. It could be the second one more than the first, over time. I went inside and started the pre-departure systems check for the first morning crossing. Wednesday comes around every week. The water is not always still, and when it isn't, I run the crossing the way I always have, on schedule, with Petra counting at the gangway, and Cass catching lines at Teller Point, and the instruments reading what they read. On still Wednesdays, I mark the waypoint in my mind, the same way I mark weather, not anxiously, not performatively, just attentively. The draft has been normal since October. Petra and I have not discussed it at length. There is not much to discuss. Ruth Carver called me once, in November. She'd heard from someone in Teller Point that I'd been asking questions. I told her the stop had been made, and that the draft had normalized. She was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, "Good." Just that, the same way Petra had said okay on the first night, a word that contains more than it shows. Before she hung up, she said, "My father would have wanted to know someone was still paying attention." I'm paying attention. That's what I can tell you. The lake does what it does, and I do what I do. And every last crossing of the night, I take us out across 4.5 miles of still black water, with the deck lights on and the instruments accurate, and one hand on the wheel. And I pay attention to all of it. The draft, the surface, the sounds the engine makes in cold air, the same way I have for 19 years, and also differently now. The way you do anything once you stop treating it as backdrop and start treating it as the actual place you are.